Good evening and welcome to Appetizers for the Mind. My name is Maureen McDonald. I'm the Dean of Science at McMaster University, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here this evening. I would like to start off by thanking all of the McCall MacBain Postdoctoral Fellows who will be sharing their research with you tonight. That includes Dr. Bhanu Sharma, Dr. Monica De Paolo, Dr. Andy Turco, Dr. Felipo Costantini, and Dr. Jan Pols. I also want to thank Connie and Joe for building the program from the ground up. And also especially to Marcy and John McCall MacBain for investing in the program and making it possible, and to Christine Kennedy for assisting with the event. Here at McMaster University, we are research-focused and student-centered faculty with a vision for transforming our world through science. Tonight, you are going to get to meet 5 brilliant researchers who are doing exactly that as McCall MacBain Postdoctoral Research Fellows. While we're all meeting virtually, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. This land acknowledgement will show respect for Indigenous peoples and their enduring connection with their traditional territories and its histories. We are guests on the territory where we currently have the privilege to study, live, and work, and it's important to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land and the history they share with this land as one step towards reconciliation. At McMaster University and in the Faculty of Science, we are committed to the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we hope to foster an environment in all of our activities where all of our stakeholders are aware of and serious about reconciliation. While giving this land acknowledgement is one step towards reconciliation, it's important to recognize that it is only one small step towards equity and inclusion. We acknowledge the traditional territories upon which we gather, and that McMaster University specifically is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. The wampum in that agreement symbolizes the dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent the people who are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. For many thousands of years, the first people sought to walk gently on the land, offering their assistance to the first European travelers and sharing their knowledge for survival in what was at times a very harsh climate. As a descendant of those European settlers, I acknowledge how important it is for us to seek a new relationship with the original peoples of the land, and that relationship to be based on honor and deep respect. May we be guided by love and right action as we transform our personal and institutional relationships with our Indigenous friends and neighbors and in our interactions with each other. So on behalf of the McMaster University and the Faculty of Science, I want to welcome all of the postdoctoral fellows who will be presenting tonight. Thank you to our audience for taking up the challenge of attending, and to our postdoctoral fellows for taking up the challenge of explaining their research. We've given them a big challenge. We've asked them to explain their life's work and their passion in just about 10 minutes. And we're asking them to do that in a way that is informative, entertaining, engaging, and most importantly for the audience tonight, accessible for everyone. It's a tall order, but I think they're going to deliver on it. Community outreach and engagement in activities like this is a strategic priority for the Faculty of Science. We encourage and support all faculty members, postdocs, students, and staff to be science communicators and champions. It's not enough, and we've seen that during the pandemic, to do research in a lab or out in the field. Now more than ever, we need scientists to talk about their research, to make the case for why science matters, and therefore to transform our world through science. We need faculty members like Dr. Constance Imbault and Dr. Joe Kim, who are the facilitators of this program. Together, Connie and Joe built the McCall MacBain Postdoctoral Fellows Teaching and Leadership Program from the ground up. They created this Made in Mac program that is unique amongst Canadian universities. It's intensive and hands-on, and it helps brilliant researchers become exceptional teachers and communicators. Tonight's event is part of the curriculum for that program. The program that Joe and Connie built was made possible thanks to this generous gift from Marcy and John McCall MacBain. Marcy is a proud McMaster graduate. Together with her husband, John, they've provided dozens of postdoctoral fellows with a one-of-a-kind opportunity to advance their careers and prepare for leadership roles. Finally, as I said at the beginning, I want to thank Christine Kennedy for helping organize tonight's event. You won't see her anywhere here, and she keeps her camera off almost all the time, but Christine is one of those people who's always working behind the scenes on events that connect our researchers with smart and curious audiences, just like you. Audiences who believe in the power of continuous learning and the ability of science to transform what we're doing. Thanks to all of you for joining this evening. I know that it will be time well spent, and that although many of you could be watching Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, lots of other things, you chose to be with us. And so now I'd like to turn it over to this evening's host, my colleagues, Joe Kim and Connie Imbalt.
Thank you so much, Dean McDonald. And thank you at home for joining us tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who's charged with the task of doing all the things that Dean McDonald just said, delivering, talking about their passion and what they've been up to for their research careers in just 10 minutes. So our first speaker is Dr. Bhanu Sharma. His research interests lie at the intersection of concussion, neuroimaging, and exercise science. He aims to keep a multidisciplinary perspective to advance the field with new insights. And recently, Bhanu completed his first marathon in 2021, and apparently he's still recovering. So we're looking forward to your talk, Dr. Bhanu Sharma.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you everybody for joining. My name is Bhanu Sharma, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about rethinking concussions. So when we hear about concussions, our minds, mine included, may be drawn first to sport. And sport's actually a really good example of an area in which there's been considerable rethinking of concussion. And this has led to some meaningful change with respect to, for example, how the injury is perceived. And to expand on that, I'm going to reference our national pastime of hockey. And here's a picture from many years ago with Eric Lindros in the middle of the screen. And during his prime, he was known as a bit of a bruiser, I suppose, and he handed out many hits, many of which were celebrated, even though they might have led to some injury in the opposition. But later in his career, as many of us know, Eric Lindros suffered a number of concussions himself. And these injuries led to some complications that forced him to take time away from the game and may potentially have even led to an earlier retirement. Now, as I mentioned at the top, it's important to rethink concussions because it changes the way that, for example, the injury is perceived. And that's in large part and thanks to individuals like Eric, who now retired, is working to try to make the game safer for youth. So I'm presenting this example because it shows the power of rethinking concussion. So it upturned the status quo. We had concussions accepted as a byproduct of the game. It's now being seen as something that needs to be removed in the interest of player health. And I want to use this example to draw on a larger point. So there is rethinking ongoing in other areas of concussion as well. And more specifically, scientists, including myself and other researchers at McMaster University, we're rethinking how concussion can best be managed. And this is leading to exciting new findings that are upturning the way we thought about concussion management and setting a new standard. Now, before I get into that in a little bit more detail, I do think it's important for us to come up with a working definition of concussion for this talk, just because there are a number of different resources out there, and I think it's important we get on the same page for defining a concussion, at least for this talk. And here we can consider concussion a mild brain injury caused by a hit to the body that shakes the brain, as seen here on the left in this dramatized animation. And concussions are injuries that can happen without being knocked out. And they're injuries that can lead to different types of symptoms in different people. So it's often said that no two concussions are alike. With respect to the big, bad, and ugly of concussion, so it is a big problem, and we know this. So there's about 150,000 people in Ontario who get a concussion every year. And these rates are rising, particularly in youth and the elderly. The bad is that there can be many different types of symptoms with concussion that can be tough to manage, and they can have an impact on perceived quality of life. And the ugly is that, unfortunately, up to 30% of people who get a concussion can develop long-term symptoms, and these are symptoms that last on the scale of months and in rare instances, years. Now, traditional treatments for concussion were ineffective. These were taking a passive approach to avoid secondary injuries rather than a proactive approach towards recovery. And this happened because we knew that having 2 concussions in a short period was worse than having 1, and 3 was worse than 2, and so on and so forth. So this led to a model where injury avoidance was prioritized over proactive recovery of the initial injury. And in turn, this may have led to what you may have heard of as a dark room approach, where patients were told to rest in a dark room until their symptoms naturally resolved. Or athletes, recreational and professional, were told to take time away from sport and avoid contact and drills and other things. And children were often advised to stay away from the classroom because the classroom can be overstimulated. Now, some of these recommendations are important, such as avoiding contact by playing sports soon after a concussion, because we do want to avoid those secondary injuries. But we also need to move towards a more proactive approach that targets management of the original injury itself. Nonetheless, rest was thought to be best for concussion, and rest was prescribed after a concussion until symptoms naturally improved. But as mentioned at the top, there has been some rethinking of how concussions should be managed, and this is changing the way we are approaching injury management. Now, it's actually thought that exercise can be medicine for concussion, and this is upturning the prior rest is best status quo. So scientists have found that low to moderate intensity exercise, or cardio training on a treadmill or a stationary bike, is actually better than rest after a concussion. So instead of resting for the entirety of the day and hoping that symptoms naturally resolve, we can take a more proactive approach. And there's data now to suggest that breaking up your day, breaking up that prolonged period of rest with a bout of low intensity exercise on a treadmill or a bike can actually improve outcome. And there's also some data from the on adult concussion that suggests that breaking up your day with bouts of physical activity, so maybe going for a walk or taking a dog for a walk, things of that nature, can also improve concussion outcome. And a combination of the two has also a better effect than rest following concussion. So exercise, as our evidence base now suggests, can help improve many of the symptoms and complications caused by a concussion. And here we have a common symptom scale, which has 2021 items, and it's used to measure different symptoms associated with a concussion. And there's a large amount of data now that suggests that actually exercise is improving symptoms in those with a concussion. We also have some data on adult concussion, which should suggest that exercise can improve some mental health outcomes. And we are working here at McMaster University to understand the effects of exercise on brain function in children with concussion, because after all, concussions are brain injuries. Now, here's an example of being a little bit impatient with the status quo and changing the status quo help concussion patients improve. So if you think about it, rest and exercise are completely opposite management strategies. They've been called diametrically opposed by some of the researchers in the field. But challenging the status quo and rethinking concussion helped us adopt a completely new strategy towards managing concussion, and this is helping many patients. So it's a story of how science can upturn norms to better patient health. And I think the story of concussion is just one example of how science can not only create important but incremental change, but also shift paradigms entirely when you maybe rethink of a problem. I'd like to thank everybody for their time and the McCall Foundation and the organizers, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bhanu, for your talk. It's super interesting. And I know that there's a lot of people out there who want to learn about this sort of stuff. So we actually do have a couple of questions from the audience. And I'll ask you one now, and then we'll save the rest until after all the talks. But the one that we've asked is, why do concussions reoccur after head impacts, and what affects severity?
So this is a great question. So in terms of the first part, the part A, I guess, into why secondary injuries occur, we're coming up with mechanisms and we're understanding more. I think there still is some more to be understood here. There's some vulnerability, especially acutely in the days after concussion, for sustaining a secondary injury. And there was a tragic report of a rugby player in Ontario, Rowan Stringer, who unfortunately passed away from multiple injuries in a short succession. But we're working towards understanding why this vulnerability exactly exists. And the second question about severity is a good one. So I know there are, for example, my postdoc supervisor, Mike Noseworthy, is quite interested in this and quantifying the severity of a concussion. There's lots of factors that play into this. No two injuries are the same. The impact is different. The way it's perceived is different. Things like neck strength affect how many shear forces may be translated to the brain. So we're working towards a better measure of concussion severity, and we recognize that's important, but I don't know if we have a graded scale or anything right now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Maybe that's the next direction for some research. Thank you so much, Bhanu, and I'll pass it back to Joe.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Monica Paoli. She is a physician and a postdoc researcher in the Overlook lab at McMaster University. Her research investigates the protective role of estrogen in pancreatic beta cell health and function and atherosclerosis progression, and how women are overlooked in medical research. Monica loves soccer, and when living in Italy, was a season ticket holder of her favorite Italian soccer team. Needless to say, she was also very happy with the outcome of the recent European soccer tournament. Over to you, Dr. Paoli.
Thank you very much. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about sex differences in biomedical research. But before I do that, I want to talk to you about what my typical day is. So I wake up and I usually have a list of things that I want to achieve. Some of them are related to my work. Some of them are personal. And then I turn on my laptop and I'm overwhelmed with a lot of emails. And each email is asking me to do something else and something on top of all my list of things to do. So my everyday looks like an ever-growing, constantly, an ever-growing to-do list. And among the things that I like to do is I like to save some time for me to go for a walk. But for example, today, because of this ever-growing to-do list, I was not able to do that, which you might think, given the fact that it was so cold, it's not even a bad idea. But anyway, I'm going to ask you, have you ever had days where your to-do list is growing so much that so many things that you have there become an I'll do it later kind of thing? And I'm pretty sure we've all been down that path. Researchers included, unfortunately. So I'll do it later in biomedical research. Is that true? Is that really a thing? Unfortunately, yes. So biomedical research encompasses a broad area of research where we perform research in cells, in animal models, as well as in humans. And up until among the majority of the time, we've been conducting studies predominantly using male subjects. And this was done mainly because we wanted to have simpler systems. So researchers in the past didn't really want to deal with situations such the fluctuations of hormones that we see in female subjects. So they thought, okay, let's just study a simpler subject, so male subjects, and then apply our findings to the general population, which includes men, women, and gender diverse people. So you might think there's nothing wrong with that, right? Well, unfortunately, as researchers of the past, we were wrong. And this one-size-fits-all approach was not really the great way to go. because we've been observing in recent years that women tend to experience more side effects than men, especially for medications such as painkillers and medication for cardiovascular diseases. Women can have up to twice as much risk to have side effects than men. But then at the same time, women tend to be protected from the development of certain diseases such as diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. And at the same time, we also have that autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis tend to be more frequent than, in women than men. So as you can see, this one-size-fits-all approach is not the proper way to go. And so the good news is that the major funding agencies in North America, so the NIH for the States and the CIHR for Canada, are actually trying to switch this mindset. And they are urging researchers to include sex as a biological variable and gender. So in this case, it's important to note that we need to rethink how research is carried out. So we can't say that we are doing an inclusive research if we just include males and females in our study subjects. But it's important that we include them and we analyze the sex effects towards our research question. So it's important that we perform quality research versus quantity research. And this is where my research project comes into place. So my research project studies the effects of estrogen in pancreatic beta cell health and function. So in non-nerdy ways, I am basically studying how women are protected from developing diabetes when compared to men. So I'm going to give you a little example in my research study of how important sex differences are. So to study diabetes, we are using a mouse model which has diabetes, and this diabetes is induced by a genetic mutation. So as expected, our male mice are diabetic. And in this picture, I want to show you what you see here is a pancreatic beta cell. So the pancreatic beta cells are the ones you see in green. And the green fluorescence is basically insulin, which is the major regulator of diabetes. You might have recalled that people with severe diabetes rely on insulin to control their glucose levels. So as you see here, these males are diabetic and the green fluorescence is there, but it's not that prominent. Whereas females, even though they have the same genetic mutation, they are not diabetic. They are only transiently diabetic, and then their levels of glucose normalize. And this is happening when their female sex hormones are peaking. And as you can see here, we have another image that shows us that insulin is produced normally. And as we saw, these females are able to fully control their glucose levels. So my project and also the recent changes in the NIH and CIHR policies are very important. But we still need to take more steps, because by studying sex as a biological variable and gender, we're going to better understand how these are influencing everyone's health. And in particular, this is important because it will allow us to get better preventative as well as therapeutic strategies. So that being said, are you ready to come on a walk with me and not do it later? Thank you so much for your attention.
Hi, Monica. Thank you so much for your talk. Some really interesting and important work that you're doing at the university. So we have a question from the audience. And so again, if you have any more questions for Monica, you can just paste them in the chat and we can ask after all of the talks. But we have a question that asks, what in your opinion is the most surprising difference between men and women's physiology or their response to medication?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. So I think what is more surprising is probably when we're talking about the response to medication is seeing how we have female subjects having much more risk of side effects. And there have been studies where ideally they hypothesize, oh, maybe it's just because of their the way their physical features are, maybe because of the body weight, it's a bit, they're a bit smaller. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So there's clearly an influence of sex hormones in how we are dealing with this medication. So I think that is really interesting to know. And as a physician, since it's 2022 and we're still prescribing the same medication with the same doses in males and females, it's so important that we take a look thoroughly at all these things and particularly aim at a better therapy and more targeted therapy for all of us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica. And I'll pass it off to Joe.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Andy Turco. He's a comparative physiologist, and he works here at McMaster University with Graham Scott and Sigal Balshine. His primary research interest is in understanding the behavioral and physiological strategies that fishes use to cope with changing environmental conditions. He's been obsessed with fish since childhood and even taught his grade 6 science teacher the word ichthyologist on an assignment about what he wanted to be when he grew up. And my precocious 10-year-old confirmed that that term has something to do with tonight's talk. Over to you, Andy.
Hi, thanks very much, Joe, and thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. So today I want to talk about some of my work on the endangered animals in our own backyards. So first, I'd like you to all just take a moment and think of an endangered animal, the first thing that comes to mind. I bet the first thing that popped into mind for most of you was some sort of exotic mammal, maybe something like a rhino, a giant panda, perhaps even a Siberian tiger. It's very natural, I think, to think of these amazing mammals from far off places for us here in Canada. But today I'm here to convince you that we need to spend just as much time thinking about endangered animals that live right in our own backyards. So Canada is home to over 800 species at risk, which means that these are organisms that are in danger of extinction. And of these 800, 363 are classified as endangered, which means that they are very likely to become extinct in the near future. And as you can see on this map, these endangered species really are concentrated in the southernmost parts of Canada. And that obviously also tends to be where most of us live. So these endangered animals really are in our own backyards. And of all the habitats we have in Canada, freshwater ecosystems are perhaps the most threatened of all of them. Almost 1 in 3 freshwater fishes and about half of our bivalve mussel species in Canada are currently considered at risk of extinction. And so my job as an aquatic biologist here at McMaster is trying to understand how we can better conserve these freshwater animals. And in particular, I've lately been really focused on this incredible endangered fish called the red-side dace, pictured here. And these are gorgeous animals that would be right at home on a tropical reef somewhere. But red-side dace are actually native to streams across southern Ontario. This species actually used to live in Spencer Creek, although sadly they haven't been found there in quite a while. One thing that makes red-side dace so fascinating is that they are primarily aerial predators. They actually jump out of the water and capture flying insects on the wing as the bulk of their diet. In fact, we think red-side dace might actually be the only species of fish on the entire planet that makes their living doing this kind of thing. That behavior makes them really fun to watch in the wild, but this behavior also makes red-side dace a really important conduit of nutrients between the terrestrial and aquatic worlds. They're really important for the streams that they live in. And we know that red-side dace populations tend to crash as their habitats get urbanized. So this map here shows the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And streams here in blue show where red-side dace populations remain to this day, but red areas here are places where red-side dace have been lost to us. And what I want you to notice basically is that these red areas basically tend to represent places where there's been a lot of urban development. But prior to my research, we didn't really have a good idea of why exactly urban development was so harmful to red-side dace, which made it really hard to conserve this species. So my research uses a lot of these streamside experiments to measure physiological limits of fish like red-side dace. So I do things like catch fish in the wild and house them in small containers pictured here, while I adjust the parameters of the water that surrounds them and I evaluate the physiology of the fish in response. And one thing my work has really shown is that warm water temperatures seem to be really harmful for red-side dace. And this is particularly important because we know that urban development often brings with it really increased temperatures. So this phenomenon is often known as the heat island effect. So this is a thermal image of our backyard, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And what I want you to notice is that urbanized built up areas sort of here and down here in red and orange are about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius warmer than surrounding undeveloped areas. And so what this means, this urban heat island then causes this background increase in water temperatures that can really be damaging to aquatic life. But urban streams are also subject to some sudden spikes in temperature when it rains. And so on this graph, the y-axis shows you water temperature in an urban stream, and the x-axis just shows 1 day of time. And this arrow here shows a rain event. And what happens is when it rains in a city, we can see increases in stream water temperatures of up to 8 degrees Celsius. This is because the rain hits really hot pavement before it flows into the adjacent waterways. And this kind of spike is exactly the opposite of what you see in a natural system, where rainfall tends to cool things down. And we think that these sorts of thermal pulses, these extreme temperature spikes when it rains, are really, really important to consider for endangered species like red-side dace. But there is hope, thankfully. So restoration of urban streams, like this project pictured here, this is some bank reinforcement being done by volunteers working with the local group Ontario Streams. This kind of thing helps keep water flowing and keeps summer water temperatures low, which really helps red-side dace and many other aquatic organisms. Well-designed urban infrastructure, things like this rain garden here that help reduce stormwater runoff into our urban waterways also really helps to control these thermal pulses. So overall, I hope I've convinced you that we should do more to protect endangered species like red-side dace that live right in our own backyards. Of course, there are many strong economic reasons to protect these animals and the ecosystems that they depend on. Our freshwater habitats provide really valuable drinking water and recreational opportunities for millions of people. There are actually more than 9 million Canadians that live just within the geographic range of red-side dace. But beyond that, we also have a duty, I think, to protect nature just for nature's sake. I don't think our children should have to travel to far-flung places around the world to witness the marvels of nature. We have some incredible treasures right at our very own doorsteps, and I hope we could do everything possible to keep it that way. Thanks very much. And I really, before I answer some questions, I really want to thank a wonderful team of people I get to work with, and particularly thank the Hamilton Community Foundation, which has funded most of my postdoctoral research. Thanks very much.
Hi, Andy. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to share, I went on a hike a couple of days ago by McMaster at Coots Paradise, and there was a sign that talked a little bit about red-side dace, and I thought immediately of you. So it was really interesting to see something so close to home about your research. And we do have a couple of questions from the audience. So the one we'll ask now is, what do you think we can do as individuals to help our local species?
Yes, everyone wants to, or not everyone, sadly, but lots of people want to know what they can do to help, and that's great. So I would say sort of the most impactful things that individuals can do would be things like planting a rain garden on their property, doing something to make sure that their downspouts don't feed directly into a storm sewer, do something to help rainfall infiltrate the ground, plant a pollinator garden that brings more insects for animals like red-side dace to feed on. But ultimately, I want to just say that many of these problems, we search for these individual solutions. And I just don't think that any number of individual actions is really what it takes. These are big systemic problems. They need big solutions. So the best thing an individual can do is sort of be informed and vote and support policy that is actually going to help endangered animals.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy. And again, I'll pass it over to Joe.
Thanks so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Felipo Costantini. He's the Marie Curie Postdoctoral Fellow at McMaster University in the Department of Philosophy and at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. His interests are in philosophy and mathematics, logic, and he's currently working on a project on the philosophy of mathematics of G.W. Leibniz. We were trying to identify, an interesting fact about Felipo outside the lab, and apparently he has no other interests. Even in his spare time, he's thinking about math. Over to you, Felipo.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thanks very much. So I'm going to expose some philosophical thoughts about mathematics. So people tend to think of mathematics as an objective science, which would describe a reality totally independent from us. And the work of the mathematician is usually seen as a work of discovering such a reality. Moreover, mathematical knowledge is seen as a process of accumulation of new and new results. Tonight, I'd like to challenge this view. And to do that, I'm going to focus on a very specific case, namely the case of the infinite. So, have you ever counted to infinity? To understand what it means to count to infinity, we must understand how we can compare different infinite collections of objects with regard to their size. So let's consider the sequence of numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so on, and the sequence of even numbers, 2, 4, 6. So one first idea would just consist in noticing that the second sequence is a part of the first one. So the even numbers are a part of all numbers. And this suggests that the even numbers are less than all numbers. However, there is another very intuitive idea, and this is the fact that we compare each element from the first sequence with exactly one element of the second sequence. So it is just enough that we pick up a number from the first sequence and we pair it with its double. So we pair 1 with 2, 2 with 4, 3 with 6, and so on. And what this suggests is that the even numbers are as many as all numbers. So we are facing a paradox here because we have two different arguments. According to the first one, the even numbers are less than all numbers, while this is not the case according to the second one, because the second one shows us that the even numbers are as many as all numbers. So how can we avoid such a paradox? So more or less 250 years ago, Leibniz, a German mathematician and philosopher, proposed a way out of this situation. And he considered the fact that we compare the numbers with the even numbers as showing that a part of the sequence of number is equal to the whole sequence. So we have as many even numbers as numbers. And he believed that this fact is impossible because this goes against one key idea, which is the idea that the whole is always bigger than its parts, which was an idea that at that time most of mathematicians believed to be an obvious mathematical truth. So his conclusion is that there cannot be a real comparison between infinite sequences, essentially because they are infinite. However intuitive this idea may sound, more or less one century and a half after Leibniz, another German mathematician, Georg Cantor, gave a totally different solution to the same problem. So again, Cantor started with the pairing between the numbers and even numbers. And he suggested that we should simply accept as a fact that a part of the sequence of numbers is equal to the whole sequence. But to do that, we must reject the idea that the whole is always bigger than its part. So Cantor's solution is essentially based on this rejection. And on this basis, it could develop a theory, a very interesting theory of infinite collections, where we have infinitely many infinite collections, and some of them are bigger than others. So in a way, we have infinities bigger than other infinities, which is, I think, quite counterintuitive, but that's the theory. And this theory became standard in mathematics. So if you speak with a mathematician nowadays about the notion of infinite, he will have in mind for sure Cantor theory. While Leibniz's view on this topic essentially got forgotten. So you may wonder whether it still makes sense to study Leibniz's view on this topic again. And I do really hope it makes sense, because it's what I'm doing at the moment. But here the key fact to understand is that there is no logical mistake in Leibniz's solution, in the precise sense that given its premises, his conclusion follows. So the disagreement between Leibniz and Cantor was a disagreement at a deeper level. They disagree about the very same concept of number. According to Leibniz, the concept of number must respect the idea that the whole is always bigger than its parts, while this is not the case for Cantor. So with all of this in mind, we can go back to our original question: is mathematics an objective science? I presented to you a paradox and two solutions. Both solutions are legitimate in the sense that, given their premises, their conclusion follows, but they are incompatible with one another. So if you accept one solution, you cannot accept also the other. So what this situation shows is that there is no objective reason to think that one solution is true while the other is false. We may have reason to prefer the Cantorian view on this topic, maybe because his theory is more powerful, is more fruitful, but these are not reasons to think that Leibniz's theory is false. Moreover, Cantor's solution essentially consists in modifying the definition of number that mathematicians had accepted until his time. And this modification is accomplished by rejecting the idea that the whole is always bigger than its parts. So there is a sense in which his theory depends on the way he characterized the concept of number. So if we put together these 2 points, I think we get a quite determined answer to our question. So is mathematics an objective science? Well, only in part, because it allows for deep disagreement between mathematicians, but also it allows for alternative but still legitimate mathematical theories. Thanks very much.
Hi, Filippo. Thank you so much for sharing your work. As someone who wanted to be a mathematician when I was a child, I find this incredibly fascinating. And so I think maybe all of us were kids at one point and tried to count to infinity. So we have a question that sort of links that. What made you want to study such a niche topic like the philosophy of mathematics?
Oh, well, that's interesting. Essentially because as an undergraduate, I liked both philosophy and mathematics. And what I liked most were like logical paradoxes. And I discovered that essentially philosophy of mathematics is all based on some different paradoxes, and you try to solve them. And you see that actually when you have a paradox, so a situation that it seems like impossible, that you don't know how to solve, then this trigger, it usually trigger a new development. So I was really interested like in paradoxes essentially. And that's the reason why I decided to work on philosophy of mathematics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think it's just so abstract to what we all know. So it's, opening up a whole new world for us. And I'll pass it back to Joe.
Okay. It's my pleasure now to introduce our final speaker for this evening, Dr. Jan Hendrik Pols. He's a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at McMaster University. During his PhD, he visited the California Institute of Technology, where he collaborated with NASA on novel thermoelectric materials. Jan studies Turkish. Well, he knows at least enough Turkish so that he can get a larger portion size at his favorite Turkish restaurant. Over to you, Jan.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Joe. As Joe said, my name is Dr. Jan Hendrik Pols, and today I will speak about thermoelectric materials. Thermoelectric materials can play a significant role in our fight against global climate change. However, they are currently not often applied in our daily life. Here, I will explain what holds them back and how to change it. If you have been recently at a gas station to fill the tank of your car, you might have been surprised by the high gas prices. And we can be certain that these prices are not the tip of the iceberg. But do you know that we use only a fraction of the gasoline for the movement of the car? Most gasoline is wasted as heat. This means we spend 50 cents for the actual purpose of the gasoline to transport us from A to B, and the rest is used to heat up our planet. This contributes to the rise in global temperature, which is increasing for more than 100 years. In addition to the global temperature, our energy demand keeps rising. We have a problem. We need to produce more electricity and simultaneously reduce the amount of heat. This is the challenge which we cannot tackle alone, but no worries, help is on its way. Thermoelectric materials can recover waste heat and convert it back to electricity. This will reduce our global temperature and also improve our energy household. Pretty good, huh? Thermoelectric materials are based on the Seebeck effect, which is named after the German physicist Thomas Johann Seebeck. He observed when you heat up one end of two dissimilar metals, here copper and bismuth, by keeping the other at room temperature, you would generate a magnetic field. Later, it was found that the magnetic field was caused by an electric current. So if you heat up the other side, the magnetic field will switch as the electric current moves in the opposite direction. After the discovery, several applications were developed in which the heat of gas burners were converted to electricity. However, wide-scale applications were limited by the low efficiency of metals. In 1929, the Russian physicist Abraham Joffe revolutionized electricity. He found that semiconductors are much better semiconductor materials. The efficiency improved from 0.1% for metals to about 4% for semiconductors. This improvement led to the first wide-range application in the 40s, the Russian lamp, in which the heat of a kerosene lamp is converted to electricity to power radio. This invention provided the three most essentials for a cold Russian winter night: heat, light, and some good old Tchaikovsky. Nowadays, we have a wide range of semiconductor applications. Chevrolet use semiconductor materials in the Suburbans to convert part of the lost energy back to electricity to power the electronics in the car. Semiconductor materials are also important to generate energy in space mission. This is a radioisotope semiconductor generator, in which the heat of radioactive decaying materials is converted to electricity. This generator is, for example, on board of the Voyager 2, which has passed the edge of our solar system. You might also recognize this generator from the movie The Martian, in which Matt Damon's character used the heat of the generator to survive on Mars. You're welcome, Matt Damon. Despite this promise, wide-scale applications are still limited by the low efficiency. But what holds them back? Semiconductor materials require a high Seebeck effect to convert a temperature difference to a voltage, and a high electron conduction to convert voltage to an electric current. To maintain the temperature difference, the conduction of heat has to be minimized. This unique combination of properties is comparable to Goldilocks, where she was looking for a perfect bowl of porridge. The electric properties can be separated in three regimes: metals which conduct electricity, insulators which don't conduct electricity, and semiconductors which have electrical properties between them. The Seebeck effect decreases from insulators to metals, while the electron conduction shows the opposite trend. If we combine both, we get information about the semilectric efficiency. Insulators have a too low electron conduction, and metals have a too low Seebeck effect. However, the optimum semilectric efficiency can be found in semiconductors, which are like pizza. Seriously, who would prefer a bowl of porridge over pizza? The conduction of heat in semiconductors, on the other hand, can range from very, very high, like diamond, to very, very low, like glass. Therefore, semiconductor materials require the electrical properties of semiconductors and the heat conduction of glass. With this insight, the semilectric efficiency has nearly doubled over the last 20 years. However, to make the final step for wide-scale application, it's like searching for a needle in a haystack, except the needle is very, very tiny and the haystack is enormous. To accelerate the search, we can apply quantum calculations. Similar as a metal detector can zero in on the needle in the haystack, quantum calculations can speed up the discovery of semilectric materials. But instead of using just one metal detector, quantum calculations can be performed on many computers, increasing the speed of the discovery. Quantum calculations are based on quantum mechanical equations. With these insights, we can predict new materials and also their corresponding properties. And we can use these insights also to find the optimum semilectric efficiency, which can be used to guide experimental studies. My colleagues and I have applied quantum calculations to reveal more than 500 new semilectric materials. In our preliminary experimental studies, we found some of the predicted semilectric materials have actually high efficiency, but further investigation are still required. I would like to thank the McCall MacBain Foundation and also Joe and Connie, McMaster University, and also you for listening. And if you are interested to read more about this, you can read my op-ed, which was recently published in The Conversation. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jan. So again, we're getting quite a few questions in from the audience. So we'll ask you just one right now, and then we'll pass it along to our Q&A. So a question from the audience, do you think thermoelectric materials can be the answer to reducing our use of fossil fuels?
No. So silence. No, I will expand it a little bit more. So I don't think that semilectric materials is the answer. I think it will be one of the answers, because we have to diversify our energy generation. So we can use semilectric materials, we can use solar cells, wind power, hydropower, or we can even combine it. So we can, for example, at the moment, we can combine solar cells with thermoelectrics, because solar cells work when you shine, the sun is shining on them, and the solar cells will heat up, and the heat will then convert it back to electricity by semilectric materials. So I would say semilectric will be one of the solution, but not the only one solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan. And so now we have quite a few questions from the audience to ask our speakers. So we don't have time for all of them, but we do thank you for all of the fantastic questions that have been coming in. There's actually too many to choose from. So my first question will go to Bhanu, who is talking to us about concussions. So the first question that we have is, where did the notion that rest was beneficial come from, when for the most like other bodily injuries, moderate exercise or physiotherapy is encouraged?
Right, that's a good question. So the rest is best approach was kind of motivated again by avoiding that secondary injury. By activity might cause a slip or a trip, or in sports you might have a collision. So it was really motivated by a goal of avoiding a secondary injury, because we know that 2 injuries and 3 injuries and so on can have compounding and more severe effects. So the rest is best approach was really a passive approach towards management and hoping to avoid further injuries down the road.
Fantastic, thank you. And actually, we just got another one in that's just come in right now. So people are asking about the brain fog that's typical of long COVID, or perhaps with Lyme disease. It seems like some of these symptoms are actually quite similar to a concussion. Do you think that the research could be similar?
It's really interesting. So a lot of the concussion symptoms on symptom scales are relatively non-specific, and there is, feeling in a fog or fogginess that's included as one of the common concussion symptoms. From what I know about what we do know currently about the brain fog and COVID, it seems like it probably will be a different mechanism. So maybe it's something biologically that's happening differently, but it's being experienced in a similar way would be my best guess right now. But I do think they may be different constructs.
Fantastic. And one final question for you. So you mentioned, dog walking, and some people want you to maybe give an idea about the length of exercise that has been studying, and can you use something like paddling, running, or weights?
Sure. So that's a good question. So I didn't get into this too much in the talk, but when we're prescribing exercise now, so we have tests that we can do in the lab on a treadmill or a stationary bike, which we get a sense of what kind of exercise you can tolerate. And it's based on what heart rate you can achieve without experiencing symptoms. And then based on that, a program can be structured. And it's typically, if you're following the exercise prescription, it's 20 minutes of exercise at 80% of the peak heart rate you achieved during that test in the lab or in the clinic. And you do that about 5 days a week and then slowly build your tolerance. And a goal of the exercise is to really engage the autonomic nervous system, which is a big branch of our nervous system, which seems to be impaired in concussion. And the exercise is actually a great way to create the biological change that we need to help address that type of pathology and concussion. I'll leave some time for my other fellows, but I'll just say quickly, weights is probably unadvisable just because of maneuvers where there's more breath holding or static positions. There might be some intolerance with respect to changes in cerebral blood flow, so that might not be a great idea. Paddling, I cannot say I've seen anything, but just in terms of doing something a little bit more low risk to still get active, I think a treadmill or a stationary bike is your best bet.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Bhanu. I hope I don't need to ever use your advice, but I have it just in case. And now we have some questions for Monica, who is talking about sex differences in biomedical research. So we have a couple of questions about, comparing different groups in biomedical research. We have some about should we be comparing age or generations? And perhaps what will the biological gender research, how will it take into account long-term transgender biological research and impacts?
Thank you, Connie. These are all great questions. So indeed, if we want to be very inclusive, we need to take into account all these groups. I wasn't able to go into too much detail about my research, but I can say that in terms of considering aging, that is actually one of the many aspects of my project. And the reason being the fact that women are protected from diabetes before menopause, so that's when their estrogen levels are high. But then once they reach menopause, so their estrogen levels are lowering down, they become as prone to developing diabetes as men. And in particular, they can have much more severe complications. So we do have clinical studies that are actually looking at all this. And we also, in my project, but in general, we can also reproduce or at least sort of create models with animals that are similar to menopause. So that is actually something that's being done. In terms of the effects of hormonal therapies for transgender people, for example, that is also an area of research that it's very poorly understudied and poorly understood at the moment. And so I am a strong advocate that looking at sex as a biological variable also implies looking at how hormones are affecting systems. So that is definitely an area that needs to be researched more in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. And so just speaking about menopausal women, are postmenopausal women affected differently by medications than premenopausal women?
So that's another good question. So what happens is that because we have these hormonal fluctuations, as a consequence of that, we also have some modification in our body, in our structure. So yes, we can have some modification in how we are responding to medication after menopause. But again, this is such an area that is so understudied that we need to increase our attention on these topics.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica.
Thank you.
And next up, we have quite a few questions for Andy. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for submitting all of your fantastic questions. And the two questions that we got for Andy are actually quite similar, and maybe something that I identify with, as I have quite a few fish at home myself, and that includes tetrafish, which kind of look like the red side dace. So I guess, yeah, the questions are, can we try to keep some of these cute little fish as pets, or can we help this vulnerable fish species to be bred in captivity? Perhaps maybe our fishery farms can assist with stocking the population.
Those are fantastic questions. And Connie, you're right. Red side dace are actually quite closely related to the aquarium tetras. They're all cyprinids, which is kind of cool. So is it possible to keep them as pets? I mean, yes. As a researcher, I have aquariums full of them on campus at McMaster, and they do extraordinarily well in captivity. Legally, can you keep them? No, absolutely not. So please don't keep them, at least until recovery efforts are further underway, and it's okay to collect them from the wild. But so the more serious question, I guess, can these fish be bred in captivity, and what can that do for conservation? That's something that's really near and dear to me, and something that I spend a lot of time as a researcher doing. We have worked to establish captive populations, and we have tried to get them to breed, but this is where I can introduce another really interesting bit of red side dace biology. They lay eggs in nests every spring when water temperatures start to warm up, but they don't build their own nests. They actually take over the nests of other minnows and lay their eggs in there. They're kind of these brood parasites. And that makes it really hard to breed them in captivity, because you're not just trying to breed red side dace. You actually need to try to breed two species of fish and get them into good condition and everything at the exact same time. So it's been a struggle. We're doing fun things with like 3D printed models of the host fish to try to simulate nests. We're trying hormone injections, but we also can only try for like 1 week a year, because they just breed once in the spring. So it's logistically very challenging. But yes, we're working on it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy. And I guess also it's probably difficult since they're aerial feeders. I'm not so used to, trying to feed my fish above the water, so that might pose a challenge as well.
So they'll learn to eat in the water, but it's actually, so it's very fun to hold fish over the tank, or hold food over the tank and watch them jump. And when you bring them in from the wild, they are hilariously bad at eating in the water column. They'll sort of try to grab food and they'll miss a bunch of times, but without competition in an aquarium over a few weeks, they do get pretty good at it.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Andy.
Thank you.
And then thank you. We have a question for Felipo, who is talking to us about the philosophy of math. And I guess maybe we're thinking that you and Jan can maybe work together. So the question is understanding infinity a problem that can be, quote, solved by artificial intelligence?
Oh, that's very interesting. So as I see it, artificial intelligence is very useful when it comes to computation. But the problem that I mean, I'm not an expert of artificial intelligence, but the problem that that I see when it comes to the notion of infinity in mathematics is that this notion requires a lot of non-constructive reasoning, and non-constructive is a technical term, but just to give you an example, essentially a non-constructive proof is like a proof where you show that there must be a mathematical object with a certain property, but you are not able to show an example because you don't have like a mechanical procedure, an algorithm that allow you to compute that number, that object. So I think that maybe this is a problem when it comes to artificial intelligence, maybe a limit when it comes to the notion of infinite. Yeah, so, but I mean, it's just a guess. So I mean, let's see what the future will bring us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Filippo. I think, again, yeah, you're expanding people's minds with things that they just haven't ever thought of before. So it's really interesting. Thank you. And last up, we actually have a couple of questions for Jan, who is our last speaker of the night. So the first question that came in was, do you think that warning labels on gas station pumps would help consumers better understand the risks associated with fossil fuel use?
Actually, that's a good question. And I haven't thought about this too much, but I think this is a good idea to put at least a sticker on it. It works for many things. For example, for LEDs, they put a sticker about how much you can save when you change from a glass bulb, from a light bulb to an LED. So when you make a sticker about on the gas stations, I think it would be helpful to get the attention about fossil fuels, how much we actually wasted, and also about the transition to electric cars. But then again, electric cars are good and bad, so I should not say so much about electric cars at the moment.
Awesome, thank you. And our final question of the evening is there an optimal material for the Seebeck effect, which is similar to maybe the optimal material for the Peltier effect?
Peltier, yeah. This is a very good question. So the Peltier effect is actually the opposite effect. This means you use an electric current to produce a temperature difference. You use it, for example, in electric fridges, or I think some of you have electric cool boxes at home. One thing is very funny. You can actually change the wires. And so instead of cooling, it will actually heat up. And the Peltier effect is related to the Seebeck effect by the temperature. So when you increase the Seebeck effect, you also increase the Peltier effect. They are proportional to each other.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to pass it back to Dean McDonald.
Wow, thank you so much to all of our speakers this evening, and to Joe and Connie for hosting so well. Where else would you be in a talk where you could hear of everything from Chevrolet to Matt Damon to Goldilocks in a single scientific talk? You'd contemplate and take yourself all the way back to childhood and think, did I ever try to count to infinity? And if I did, you know, when did I stop? How far deep did I get? I don't know how many of the rest of you were thinking, if I did want to install a rain garden, how would I do that? And where is my downspout connected to? Such useful things. And the next time that I see some biomedical research, which we are seeing all the time right now, will you be thinking about who are the participants in that study? What was their gender diversity? What populations were represented in that study? Asking science is all about those questions. And I've saved perhaps one that's most near and dear to my heart to the last to mention and acknowledge. That is the fact that I know I am a kinesiologist from the kinesiology department who studies exercise. But if we had a single pill that did everything that exercise did, I think everyone would be taking that every day. The thing that I was most amazed with tonight is that I know you had time to prepare your talks and your images were phenomenal. But the true test of a scientist is if on the spot, you can think about your research and answer a question that you had no idea was coming at you, and answer it with the connection to your passion as well as your science. So I am incredibly impressed by all of you. I am thankful for everyone who stayed and listened to this evening. And I hope that you are just as inspired as I was in looking to the future of what can happen when we have these wonderful scientists start to lead in many, many spaces. So thank you so much on behalf of McMaster University for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.